Okay, doke. Are we there? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, but you can't
Okay,
hear
because
us.
my screen is co-opted by my PowerPoint, so I can't see you right now, but that's all right. You know, as people often say, I have a face for radio. I'm Harvey Webster, and I am one of a group of four, Steve Madewell, Rich Benz, and Dan Best, who are charged by Peter Pesch with carrying on the Ecophilia torch. And we're really excited about today's edition because we're coming to you live from Clapp Tower on the campus of Case Western Reserve University, courtesy of Dr. Darren Croft and some very enterprising graduate students. We have got, we hope, a beachhead here and maybe the potential for an institutional home going forward, which is something that we haven't had since they started the renovation of the Natural History Museum, and sort of there was no place for us to be there. So we're very, very excited about this and the potential for getting involvement of CWRU faculty and students in doing programs or attending programs. So we're on the cusp of something we think is really exciting. Sorry, it has to start with my program, but I spent 47 years at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History as their number of hats. My last hat was Chief Wildlife Officer and Museum Ambassador. They gave me an Ambassador Emeritus status. I thought that came with a sash. Apparently it does not, so I'm a little disappointed. But it meant that if I'm the ambassador of the museum, my wife is the ambassadoress because her name is Doris Webster. Anyway, so I was going through the archives on a program that I could do because we were trying to get another speaker that did not work out for today, and came up with this one. This is entitled Terminal Velocity, the Falcons and the Tower, and it's all about peregrine falcons, and specifically the peregrine falcons that came to roost, as it were, on the terminal tower. So I'm just going to get right into it. So let's see. What do I have to do? I have to do that. What click? What do I have to do here?
It's just the side arrow.
Not that.
That's not doing that. Help! Brady, help! Help!
He has to, I know what he has to do, but you know,
Oh,
for some out there. No.
This is working now.
Yeah.
Okay, so peregrine falcons, that's the bird in question.
What's
This is a peregrine falcon, a young peregrine falcon chasing an adult hoping for a meal. Great photograph taken in downtown Cleveland. Peregrine falcons are raptors, and raptors are really kind of an interesting term. When you think about raptors, most people think about this. They think about a velociraptor. They think about a theropod dinosaur. And actually, there's a lot to be said for that. But raptor actually originally meant a flesh-eating bird. And this is a great pose. This is if you're on the receiving end of the attention of a territorial peregrine falcon with the talons about to be outstretched and about to be embedded into your head and neck. Personal experience. So they define raptor as it's sort of a loose confederation of families of birds from several orders. And the important part of this is there's some of them are totally unrelated to one another. And it's an amazing example of convergent evolution. And it comes from the Latin, meaning abductor, the robber, plunderer. So let's go back to the dinosaur thing. Coming from a museum of natural history, it's interesting. When I started the museum all those years ago, and we were very proud of the dinosaurs that we had on display there, there was a question about the relevance of dinosaurs. I mean, who cares about a dinosaur? I mean, they had their time in the sun. They became extinct. They're done. The Earth has moved on. But it turns out that, you know, in the intervening years, we found out so much more about dinosaurs. I mean, far more dinosaurs have been discovered in the last 40 years than in the century and a half before that. And with each incredible new discovery is made, they've been able to discover the fact that many forms of dinosaurs, particularly the two-legged, the theropods, were actually covered with feathers. And there was often, you know, perceived a link between birds and dinosaurs because birds are bipedal and these two-legged dinosaurs are bipedal, and there aren't a whole lot of bipedal organisms in the world. But again, it was thought that, okay, well, maybe that they're back in the ancestry of birds. But with the discovery of the presence of feathers, it really became clear that birds who share all these anatomical similarities and also feathers really are dinosaurs. And when we think about the non-avian dinosaurs becoming extinct with an asteroid colliding into the Earth 65 million years ago, dinosaurs actually survived that event. And now, represented by birds, they're one of the most numerous taxa of backboned animals on the planet, some 10,000 strong. So here you have examples of dinosaurs, a Blackburnian dinosaur, a bald-headed dinosaur, a chicken, and the now presumably extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. Cool thing about this is that recognizing that chickens are in fact dinosaurs means that when you go to KFC, you get Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. Just getting that out there. Anyway, coming back to these raptors. If you take a look at the left of the image here, you see a peregrine falcon, a male peregrine falcon. In the middle, you see an adult male red-tailed hawk, and on the far end, you see an adult male great horned owl. And all these birds are raptors, okay, in terms of their ecological function. They're pretty much top of the food chain predator with their hooked beak. Hey, I'm getting an echo here. Can I ask a favor that maybe folks mute your microphones?
Yes, probably.
While we're doing the program? That way I don't think you'll have that annoying echo. It's hard enough to listen to me once. Okay, so they're all raptors, and yet they're really pretty much unrelated. And there's some really interesting genomic work that's been done. If you take a look here, you've got the falcons are in a group, and if you go back far enough, they're branching off of things like parrots and then songbirds like crows and finches. You've got the diurnal birds of prey, including bald eagles and the like, in the central group, and then the owls have diverged. And you see that these points of divergence happened a long, long time ago. So they've been evolving for a long period of time, and they've evolved some common structures. Those common structures being a hooked bill for tearing flesh and sharp talons, modified nails or claws, if you will, that are designed to be curved, very, very sharp. And when you close up the foot, all four talons converge on a single point, and you don't want to get that single point because the entire architecture of the foot of any of these birds of prey is for grabbing and clenching, not for releasing, and they bring a tremendous amount of force to bear. So focusing on the falcons, we've got quite a few falcons that call Ohio home. One of the most common is the American kestrel. And kestrels are interesting because in the world of birds of prey, most birds of prey, the males and the females look alike. They've got the same plumage. The primary difference is the females are larger, what we call reversed sexual size dimorphism. And there's a whole lot of theories for that. But this is a female American kestrel, and this is what the male looks like. So there's quite a lot of difference in these birds, which used to be called sparrowhawks. And you oftentimes will see them on telephone lines in rural areas where they'll fly out over an open field, having seen something moving like a meadow vole or perhaps a large dragonfly or grasshopper. They'll often turn into the wind right above where they saw the movement, flutter their wings very, very rapidly, and functionally hover. And they stay in one spot. It's not hummingbird hovering. They're into the wind. They've got their wings up at stall angle, and they're pumping those wings as fast as they can. Energetically, this is really expensive, but clearly, since they do it so often, they score a meal oftentimes. And so then they dive quickly out of that hover and grab whatever the animal is that they're going for. They're also interesting in the world of falcons in that they're cavity nesters. So here's a male kestrel coming out of a box. And actually there's ways that a lot of people are employing now, utilizing roadside signs, big highway signs, big ODOT signs, and putting nest boxes on the back side of them to facilitate the nesting and successful reproduction of American kestrels in what's a really favorable habitat, because they can hunt those median strips and the shoulders of the road. Oftentimes there's a great habitat with lots of things that they wish to eat. Next in line, we've got the Merlin. So if a kestrel is on the order of a size of a blue jay, let's say, a very chesty blue jay, maybe a little bit larger than that. The Merlin probably is about 50% larger. And Merlins, it's interesting, they've not been a bird that we see in Ohio in the past, though we are seeing them a lot nowadays. Particularly in the wintertime, they love cemeteries as places to winter. And so if you've got a cemetery near you, doesn't matter where it is, can be in the heart of the city of Cleveland, you might look for Merlins there. And they're bird killers, almost exclusively dedicated bird killers, and they love to cause mayhem. So this is a flock of starlings, and there's the Merlin going through that flock of starlings, trying to get some confusion in that murmuration to identify one bird that makes some fatal mistake. They stop for a second. They don't know which way to go. They don't know which neighbor to follow, and then they zoom in on that. They say at Cape May, the great great spring migration spot too. It's the southern tip of New Jersey, but in autumn, they have a tremendous raptor migration that occurs there. And you can be up on the Hawk Tower near the lighthouse looking to the north, and you can always tell a Merlin. Because if you see a bird, a falcon that's flying low over the tree line, and all of a sudden it goes 100 yards out of its way just to harass some poor hapless blackbird, that's a Merlin. They're the Porsche Turbo Carrera of the bird world. They're just fast and savvy, and again, feeding on small to medium-sized birds. Going up the size range, if you get into the American West, the prairie falcon is a reasonably common bird in the Rocky Mountain West. There can be, let's say, if I point over here, if you look in the wing pits of the bird, you see black in the wing pits. That's a nice field mark, as well as the fact that the stripe that comes down from the eye, the malar stripe, is a very, very thin stripe. Remember those features because they factor in the story later on. And they nest on cliffs generally, occasionally on an old nest. These guys are not great at making nests. They like to usurp something else, but cliff nests out in the Rocky Mountains. And they do kill a lot of birds, but they also can go for ground squirrels and a lot more mammalian prey. The biggest of the lot is the gerfalcon, and we don't see gerfalcons much down here, but if you're fortunate to get up to northern Alaska in the Brooks Range, you get up to Greenland. These things, think of a bird that's at least the size of a red-tailed hawk, but it's a falcon. And I'm going to get into some of the attributes of falcons that can kill easily a goose or something of that size. This is a really, really powerful bird. And this is the bird that Arab falconers are infatuated with, because there is a morph of this bird that's almost pure white with black flecking on it. And it's a striking bird. It looks like the diurnal equivalent of a male snowy owl. And somehow, if you're hunting in the desert and you've got a snow white bird on the gauntlet, people pay attention to that. So this is sort of the family of falcons, but the one we're talking about today is the peregrine falcon. And you can see the peregrine falcon has a cowl on its face with this deep malar stripe that descends from the eye. And you can see the kind of slaty gray that you find in the back of an adult, and white underneath. In flight, they look like this. Wings tend to be pointed, and you see that long tail. And this is a body design that is designed for speed. These birds are incredibly fast, because if you're a peregrine falcon, what do you eat? Almost exclusively birds. And you're catching those birds in wide open spaces. There is no hiding behind a tree and exploding out on something like a Cooper's hawk. This is your prey knows you're coming. As soon as you make a move and commit, your prey knows you're coming. And so what these birds are capable of doing is pulling their wings up and going into something called a stoop, or a controlled power dive. Ultimately, the wings will be brought in tight to the body, and they get this kind of bullet or missile shape as they commit to the stoop.
Wow.
That's what they look like. And in that stoop, they've been clocked at just shy of 200 miles per hour, which is actually more than the terminal velocity because they're not falling. What are they doing? They're flying. They're pumping their wings. They're trying to goose every last mile per hour out of this dive so they can overtake their prey. So it's interesting when you look at that silhouette. If you go to Pinterest, as I did, you find images like this, comparing that silhouette to a B-2 bomber. And there's an awful lot in common with that silhouette. A silhouette designed for speed and stealth. And there's other analogies too, because these guys, as they're coming down, if you're going 200 miles an hour, Peregrine Falcon might weigh 2 pounds. I mean, if you had Judy on the glove, a female Peregrine Falcon, maybe 2.5 pounds, maybe a male tercel, maybe at 2 or slightly less than that. Again, the females being larger than the males. So these birds are not really that massive. And if they're coming down on something large like a duck, and the Peregrine Falcon in its day was called the duck hawk, because where you would find them in spring and fall migration was in marshes where they were hunting waterfowl. The fact is that they have to figure out how are they going to, number one, catch up to that bird, and how are they going to strike the bird to give a stunning blow without shattering every bone in their body. So it's their navigation is positional. They're constantly tweaking it as they're coming down to try and figure out that vector of how to best approach that prey. And oftentimes they will come down and they'll give a glancing, stunning blow. Now, if you're a bird and you're flying along like this gracefully in forward flight and something hits you and you stop your wing beat, you're now out of rhythm, you're out of sequence, and you're falling. And as a result, it takes you a while to kind of get your wits about you and propel yourself in forward flight. While you've got that couple seconds that you're readjusting your flight path, the falcon has come up and around, and now he's coming in with his talons blazing, and he's got you. And either they grab you and then carry you away, as in this picture here, or if it's something large, you hit it again hard, stun it, and let it drop to the ground, and then the fall kills it. And then you grab it on the ground, or you feed it on the ground if it's something larger than what you carry. This is actually a pigeon that this peregrine is carrying, but it's been plucked. So it's a male peregrine bringing food back to the nest. Once they kill something, oftentimes the first thing they do is they pluck it, and then they bring it back and deliver it to the female in the nest,
They don't eat the
young
feathers.
eyases that are in the nest. So what is food? Well, they love starlings, and they love pigeons, but they also love least bitterns, and they love waterfowl, and they love pretty much anything with wings, including bats. Bats aren't a big part of it, but we have observed the peregrine falcons in the terminal tower feeding their youngsters bats. So, when bats are starting to emerge, as long as there's enough light to hunt by, peregrines are more than equal to the task of running them down. So the business end of a peregrine falcon. Couple things here. If you take a look at this portrait, they've got enormous eyes. You'd almost think they're nocturnal beings because of the size of the eyes. But the size of the eyes in this case is just to process huge amounts of visual information and be able to spot movement, to be able to see things that are happening around you. They have that pointed bill, and the pointed bill allows you to take, once you've caught something, both to dispatch it. And if you come up from the bill, hard to see here, but there's a little, excuse me, I'm going to leave the microphone for a second. For the folks here, this little spot right there.
That's right. I forgot there was a group down there
Tomial
too.
tooth. And the tomial tooth is thought to fit neatly between the cervical vertebrae of the things that this likes to kill and eat. So maybe it's helpful for dispatching its prey. Whatever. If you take a look in the entrance to the nostril, they've got this bony tubercle, and a hypothesized function of that is if you're diving at 200 miles an hour, respiration could be a little challenging to you, normal respiration, but having a system of baffles in those nasal chambers might help mediate that. And all of the falcons share these traits. So that's the business end of dispatching and dealing with
That
prey.
is.
The other end, of course, is this end, the feet, and you can see the sharp talons there. You also notice that he's got really long toes. If you compare this to a red-tailed hawk, for instance, these toes are much longer. So much so that back in the day, John James Audubon, the great artist, ornithologist, actually described the peregrine falcon as the great-footed hawk. And the hypothesis behind that is the longer the toes, the wider your reach. They're actually stunning a bird with clenched talons, but when they're coming back to grab it, it turns out that the wider the reach you have, if something is trying to escape you, that probably gives you a better opportunity to grab it. And you see that they're feeding on some really tasty gadwall and a green-winged teal. So, other neat thing about peregrine falcons, rather, is peregrine falcons are truly cosmopolitan. You find them on every continent on this planet, save Antarctica. And so it's a really interesting bird. In some areas, they're non-migratory. So peregrine falcons in Cleveland, Ohio, stay in Cleveland, Ohio. But others are some of the most migratory birds on the planet. There are birds that nest in the Brooks Range, the tundreous subspecies of Falco peregrinus. And those birds go all the way down as far as Tierra del Fuego at the southern end of Argentina. So an epic migration from one end of the Western Hemisphere to the other. So they're capable of all sorts of things. And you can see them in a variety of habits in places like Australia. Typically, they're cliff nesters. Again, they don't build a nest. They look for a secure place that's on a cliff where you've got a ledge where you have protection from mammalian predators climbing up or down to your nest, and that your youngsters will be safe there. The thing
Harvey,
about
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, actually yesterday I was looking at some MODIS data, and I happened to pick out a particular bird, a peregrine, and it actually migrated from the Midwest. I don't think it was Ohio, it might have been Indiana or whatever. And they picked it up on an antenna on the border between Paraguay and Argentina.
Wow.
So did it get mixed in with the population that doesn't migrate?
Do we know where it was originally tagged?
No, I could look that up, but I don't know.
Because if it's an Eastern Arctic, like a Quebecy or even a bird coming down from the northern part of Greenland that happens to be, its route comes through this area, it could ding a MODIS tower in Ohio on its way to South America.
Gotcha.
Typically, it's that tundreous. The Falco peregrinus annotum is the subspecies that resides in much of North America, except for the tundra areas. And they are somewhat migratory, but in places at this latitude, they're almost non-migratory. It's those ones in the Arctic that are making a headline to the southern South America. And it's interesting because they love to eat shorebirds, and there's a tremendous number of shorebirds that nest on the tundra up in Alaska, up in northern Canada, and Baffin Island, and over to Greenland, that are all headed towards southern South America. So it could be that they're also taking advantage of a ready food supply, and they're just following that food supply south. Other curious thing about peregrines is the fact that, as Roger Tory Peterson famously said, humans emerged from the fog of prehistory with a peregrine falcon on the gauntlet. That we humans have had a multi-thousand-year relationship with peregrine falcons and other birds of prey and the sport of falconry. I think that folks have always admired the flight skills of these birds of prey and how they slice through the sky and with such incredible ease. And the idea, if you train a bird for falconry, the fact is that you not only get a chance to see it in flight and take its quarry, but falcons like to eat quail and duck and pheasant and grouse. Well, who else likes to eat those things? We do. So whatever quarry the peregrine falcon takes down, you could be serving up for dinner that night. And it's interesting when you take a look at old impressions from Europe, from China, from the Middle East, all of the accoutrements are pretty much the same. Same stuff as we use today, leather jesses that go around each ankle, and they're done in such a way that they don't bind to the ankle, connected to a swivel, then to a leash, and then that's connected to a perch, and you have a heavy leather gauntlet, which you carry the bird on. And a long time ago, they discovered that diurnal birds, if you plunge them into darkness, they become incredibly quiet and calm and de-stressed. So they invented a hood, a leather hood with a reinforced air area to protect the eyes. You slip it over the bird's head, and even though you could have it in the back of your car, you could be walking through downtown Cleveland, and the bird would be totally at ease and not disturbed by any of the noises around it, because those noises are not associated, they're not accompanied by any visual image. So all of that, the stuff that was used in falconry hundreds of years ago, even 1,000 years ago, still being used by falconers in this day. And actually, if you go over to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and check out the Jim Nemeth and the crew at Wildlife Resources, including Brady, you might see folks having any one of the birds of prey on their gauntlet, utilizing the same accoutrement that these birds have right here. Yeah, including me, a much younger version of me with the peregrine falcon. I believe that's Endeavor. Okay, so I mentioned about where they nest. This is a really famous image taken by the great ornithologist and bird photographer Arthur Allen, and it's Taganic Falls at near Ithaca, New York. Allen was associated with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And down in the left foreground, you can see the nest with 3 eyases in the nest. It's a term for a young falcon or young bird of prey in the nest. And you can see the adult, framed against the waterfall. Just unbelievable image. And it's interesting because all across North America, we don't know what the population of peregrine falcons was a couple hundred years ago. Maybe it was, I don't know, a couple thousand pair were in the US and Canada. But it turns out that peregrine falcons were closely associated with these eyrie sites or nesting sites that would be used for generations. Maybe not the same individual birds. Maybe you start with male A and female A, and they're there for 10 years or so, and then some young hotshot male comes along, male B, who challenges male A, kills him, and then takes over and mates up with female A, and then she gets supplanted. So a pair of peregrine falcons is almost like a continuum in time, but the eyrie site would be used for multiple generations. And we have field records on these. Why? Because falconers wanted to know where the nests were so they could raid the nests to get young eyases to train in falconry. And so we know these long traditions, and mostly they were associated with places that had cliffs. So guess how many nesting peregrine falcons we had in Ohio 150, 200 years ago? The answer would be 0, because we just don't have cliffs. The cliffs along the Rocky River, they don't cut it for what these guys really need. And so they were nesting in Pennsylvania and New York. They were nesting up in upper Michigan and places nearby. But the birds that were coming through Ohio and recorded by early naturalists like Francis Hobart Herrick, whose picture I'm looking at there, former chair of the biology department here at Western Reserve University, and the Eagle Man of Vermilion, if they saw peregrine falcons, those would have been passage birds, birds that were in migration. They were doing their peregrinations. Now, one of the most interesting things about this, though, these bird-killing, cliff nesting birds, as soon as in the 1900s, we started building skyscrapers, peregrine falcons became infatuated with nesting on skyscrapers. This is the Sun Life building in Montreal. And almost as soon as they completed this building, there was a pair of peregrine falcons nesting on it. Likewise, as they were starting to build the skyscrapers in New York City, peregrine falcons would show up nesting on them. So this is a bird that not only can tolerate the human changed landscape, they absolutely thrive in it because we provide them with cliffs, and our cities have an abundant supply of sparrows and starlings and pigeons. And pigeons are just a really nice sweet spot as a food item for peregrine falcon. So again, we don't know quite what the population was leading up to the Second World War, but we had peregrine falcons. They certainly had been shot at and accused of causing depredation on livestock, particularly chickens and the like, whether they were responsible for it or not. And Arthur Allen talked about finding dead, shot peregrine falcons near Taganic Falls by the local farmers who just thought that they were harassing their local poultry. And so we knew that there was direct persecution, but we also creating new habitat for them in our cities and towns. But following the Second World War, all of a sudden we saw a precipitous decline in populations of peregrine falcons that was not monitored by ornithologists or wildlife biologists. It was monitored by the same falconers who had been monitoring these eyrie sites for generations. And all of a sudden they noticed these eyrie sites were not producing any young. And when they went to investigate, they saw eggs like this, eggs they're collapsed in on themselves, eggs which have this tissue thin shell on them. And it caused this, this major dilemma of what is causing the demise of peregrine falcons. And this demise, by the time we get to 1970, there's only 39 nests of peregrine falcons in the lower 48 states, and they are extinct east of the Mississippi. So the Taganic Falls pair long since gone. So this incredible decline that starts just after the Second World War. And this is an interesting thing. So the question is, okay, well, how do we know what's going on with these eggs and these nests? Well, one of the things you do is you start looking at egg collections. And of course, museums are repositories of collections. And there was a whole generation of egg collectors. It was a very popular pastime, particularly in the 1800s and early 1900s. And one of the things that caused the rapid decline in numbers of the California condor, because the egg collectors wanted eggs, and they only lay one egg every other year. So you go grab that egg, and now you've just terminated potential breeding for 2 years. So they went and Derek Ratcliffe and other biologists in England went back and they were looking through these museum collections and saying, whoa, well, these things have got these really thick eggshells. And now the eggshell fragments we're finding out of these nests are 20% thinner, 30, 40% thinner. What gives? And ultimately, the smoking gun led to dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT, which had been discovered in the late 1800s, but it was in the Second World War that its anti-insecticide properties were discovered, and it was considered to be a miracle chemical. And an awful lot of studies that were done, particularly Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, where you fed chickens DDT, and then you saw the effect months or years later on their ability to reproduce, demonstrated, in fact, that this was the problem. The problem with DDT is it and its class of organochlorine chemicals, they and their metabolites are very, very stable chemicals. You can't pee them out, you can't poop them out, you don't break them down, you don't burn them up. And so what does your body do with something that it can't figure out anything else to do with? Stow it away in your fat. And the problem is when you stow it away in your fat, if you're a female bird and it's time now to lay eggs and you're drawing on all the resources you have to be able to produce this egg in a very short period of time, you're tapping into your skeletal calcium supply, and that's facilitated, mediated by by hormones. And it turns out that at the same time you're doing that, you're mobilizing fat and the DDT or its metabolites, and it would interfere with your ability to lay a good thick eggshell in the eggs. By the way, DDT was thought to be, and those of you who saw what exists of my Romancing the Eagle program, saw some of these slides before, this was used everywhere. Here are some of the things from Life and Look magazine. Bison did it. I love the DDT and did it. Insect spray, flies, moths, fleas, roaches, mosquitoes, ants, bed bugs. Huge economic advances were made because of DDT. You think about the use on crops and be able to get greater yield. If you think about controlling malaria and the ability to control mosquitoes, hence malaria and effects on human health. But it was widely considered to be perfectly safe. You use it in the home, use it absolutely anywhere. A war-born miracle so effective you can scarcely believe it. Or this, I love the ditty, DDT is good for me, brought to you by the friendly sounding Killing Salt Chemical Company. So it was used everywhere, used in our homes, in our yards, in our agricultural fields. And it's the problem with DDT is that you get it in the environment, spray it on a crop. Let's say you're controlling for, corn borer or something. You spray a crop and then you get a rain and some of that stuff runs off into the local wetland. And then you might have, parts per trillion of, just a very, very low concentration of stuff in the water. But as, phytoplankton encounter those molecules and absorb them, now they're stuck with them. They can't excrete them or break them down. They spend their little lives then assimilating a whole portfolio of DDT, which when they're consumed by the zooplankton, get transferred to the next trophic level up. And so as you go up the food chain, you have this thing called biomagnification. Concentration at the top of the food chain, for all of a sudden the top of the food chain, bald eagles and peregrine falcons and brown pelicans and common terns and human beings, you now see outrageous concentrations, that have seemingly nothing to do with this really low background concentration because of biological magnification. And it can either outright kill the bird or have these impacts upon reproduction. And I grew up in Shaker Heights, and we used to be out on the tree lawn in Shelburne Road in Shaker Heights as this truck would come down the street because we had stately elms lining the street, and they would broadcast that mist up there, DDT, to control for Dutch elm disease, the carrier of Dutch elm disease. And we would oftentimes think this is kind of cool, and you'd feel the cool mist landing on your skin and say, well, it's kind of neat. And then you'd watch the robins drop dead, soon thereafter, and never made the connection. But fortunately for all of us, someone did, and that was Rachel Carson. And famously with her book, Silent Spring, she brought to the attention of the world the dangers of this chemical economy that we had with chemicals that we were being told were perfectly safe, but they were endocrine disruptors. They were very mobile in ecosystems, and they could disperse anywhere. They could evaporate up with moisture. There you found measurable quantities of DDT in Antarctic ice. Not a whole lot of bugs in that ice, but the fact of the matter is it was dispersing across the globe with global weather patterns. And fortunately, that led to lots of things. It led by the end of the 1960s, you've got a growing environmental movement. In 1966, a group up at the University of Wisconsin convened raptor biologists, falconers, and other wildlife biologists from across the planet to find out what was going on with peregrine falcons and what can we do to save them. Because these great sites like this had long become dormant. And again, we bottomed out in 1970 with only 39 known pairs of peregrine falcons in lower 48. So what to do? Well, out of that meeting that happened in 1966, first of all, in 1970, marvelous things start to happen. First Earth Day, EPA. Soon thereafter, we get the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, some of the most amazing legislation ever put forward by anyone, anywhere, that created a foundation for conservation, both here and by example throughout the world. So great things were happening there, but not fast enough to save peregrine falcons. So this guy decided to get involved. This is Dr. Tom Cade. He was my ornithology professor at Cornell, and a wonderful raptor biologist, great ornithologist, but guess what he was? A falconer who was distraught at what was happening to his favorite bird, the peregrine falcon. And so in 1970, he created the Peregrine Fund. And at Cornell, they created something they called the Hawk Barn, or quote unquote, Peregrine Palace. And he reached out to his falconer friends all over the world and said, would you loan me your falcons so that we can try, and even though it's never been done before, see if we can try to breed them in captivity. and then have youngsters that could be returned to the wild. Because we have to do something to staunch the decline. Otherwise, we're going to lose the bird for good. Because even though the EPA bans DDT in 1973, it takes a long, long time for that material to work its way out of the current crop of living things. So, it's kind of like actually one of his graduate students and a great ornithologist himself, Dr. Stan Temple, coined the term clinical ornithology, looking for what are the proximate causes and then the ultimate causes of decline, and what can you do in intensive management to staunch the decline and create a foundation from which you can bring the birds back. So he was able to do that. And they created the Peregrine Palace, where they had 40 breeding chambers, and they succeeded at breeding the birds both naturally, and some of the F1s, they actually hand raised, so they would be imprinted. So those imprinted individuals, imprinted to human beings, the males would voluntarily copulate with a handler. The females would lay eggs in response to a human being. So they could now manipulate the breeding biology to produce far more eggs and far more young. And they got so successful at this, by 1975, they were ready to start releasing some of the youngsters, just in 5 years. So they decided, we know those old historic eyrie sites. So they chose cliff sites. This is actually in the New River Gorge, but this is a similar apparatus that they used at Teganic Falls, right up the road, where you put this chamber, and the chamber has a long chute that goes into it. That's the food chute. Because what you're going to do is you're going to take maybe 3 or 4 half-grown peregrine falcons who've been raised by their parents, and you're going to put them in this chamber, and they're not going to ever see a human being. Once they're put in there, you scarce, and they're protected in there from any predators. And once they're about the age where they're ready to fledge, you just have a trap line and you open up the door so they can walk out on the ledge. They learn how to hunt, they learn how to fly on their own. And as they get hungry, they remember, where was the last place I got fed? Oh yeah, back there, the food chute. And they come back for food. And in time, they learn how to hunt on their own, and they become independent animals. It's a great way to introduce raptors into areas where they're extirpated. The only problem is you open up that door and they come up and they line up on this ledge. And at nighttime, the great horned owls come in and pluck them off because they're sleeping on the ledge, and it's really easy for the great horned owls to take them out. And so they were putting these youngsters out there, and just these nests were failing and failing and failing. And so they thought to themselves, what about those old urban sites, those sites on bridges and sites on skyscrapers? So they turned their attention to starting to release them from hack towers that were on top of buildings. And so buildings like the Sun Life building. And that brings us to the tower part of my story, because in 1989, okay, by the time we get to 1980, we have the first reproduction in the wild of peregrine falcons that have come from the releases at Cornell. So you're starting to create a wild population that's capable of reproducing themselves, and those are all coming off of artificial, buildings and towers and smokestacks and the like. And there were other groups, both throughout the Midwest Peregrine Recovery Group, also up in Canada, who were doing releases as well. And it turns out that in 1988, a pair of peregrine falcons show up, one from Michigan, one from Ontario, at the Commodore Prairie Hotel in downtown Toledo. And they successfully reproduce, and they have 2 youngsters. The following year, one of those birds shows up in downtown Cleveland and flirts with the terminal tower. I had a volunteer at the time, Jane Berkeley, who was working at the BP building, and she called me up and said, Harvey, I'm sure I'm seeing a peregrine falcon downtown. So that would be awesome. So we went downtown and went to her office, which looked right towards that ledge. And sure enough, we saw the peregrine falcon flying around Public Square. So we thought, this is great. So I lent her a spotting scope and gave her the challenge of keeping a detailed journal on what she saw happening in Public Square. And she identified that this 12th floor ledge, just to the right of the main shaft of the terminal tower, kind of you see that white sleeve and this little bit of metalwork to the right, is where the bird was spending all of its time. And so it turns out that we had a male, and this male, we found out later, after we trapped him, that he was in fact the bird that had been produced from the Commodore Perry Hotel the year before, because he was banded. And he was so infatuated with this and the abundant food supply of the pigeons and starlings found below, that we thought, okay, this is a place that we need to facilitate the nesting. And by the way, these pocket habitats are so incredibly important for these birds of prey that take to the city. You'll find barred owls in downtown Cleveland, which is just, baffling that this habitat for a forest dwelling owl. And you'll find Cooper's hawks and occasionally kestrels will hunt these areas. So these pocket habitats, be it Public Square or the mall, Erie Street Cemetery, are really important for local birds. They're also treacherous because in spring and fall migration, the brightly lit buildings attract night-flying migrant birds to the city. They descend to the ground at dawn to feed and rest, and now they're surrounded by plate glass, and that plate glass of those buildings mirrors the habitat they're in. They don't know that there's something that they can't, that it's solid air, as Dan Clem calls it, and they smash into it. And this kills, maybe window collisions might cause, 750,000 casualties a year in North America. Huge, huge problem. Okay, so we get back to this platform. And so because the birds were spending, the bird was spending time there, we built a nest tray. I got a couple 2x4s and some plywood and a couple buckets of gravel, and we put it out here. We pulled the shade down so that the folks that could use the Greenbrier suite. On the other side of that is the Van Swearingen's personal apartment in the terminal tower. When you walk into it, there's this grand baronial hall with all of these oak appointments that came from the Sherwood Forest or something. I mean, it's just extraordinary. You think that you're in a mansion in Shaker Heights, but you're on the 12th floor of the terminal tower. And it was their private apartment used by a law firm when this was happening. So we provide them this nest tray, and then in short order, this male has got a mate. And the mate shows up, but the mate's kind of off. The mate doesn't look right. The mate, when you look at its head, it had this really thin malar stripe as opposed to the male peregrine. That's when we caught him and learned where he came from. And a little bit of white above the eye. And those are two traits that you find in prairie falcons. However, the bird also had peregrine traits. So could it be a hybrid? And the answer is absolutely, because on one leg it also had the remains of a jess. This had been a falconer's bird. And falconers at Cornell, they mastered artificial insemination in birds of prey. And if you're mastering, you've got some peregrine falcon semen here, and you happen to have a receptive female prairie falcon there, and you're thinking to yourself, not as a biologist, but as a falconer, I wonder if I could meld the speed of a peregrine with the acrobatics of a prairie falcon. And you do it, and you get an F1. But like a mule, your F1 is sterile. And so Jenny, who we came to label her as a Jenny mule, Jenny, we discovered was sterile. We had that nest tray out there. She'd go through the motions every year, never found an egg. And so it was clear that we needed to do something to remove her so that he could recruit another female and we get reproduction at this nest. Because we're still in the early 90s, and this should be significant. I said that peregrine falcons hadn't nested in Ohio historically, but once they did in Toledo, well, gosh darn it, let's help facilitate the recovery of this endangered species. And by this time, too, you have the Ohio Division of Wildlife starting to do hacking using that process of taking young captive produced birds and releasing them from a cage on buildings in downtown Columbus. So there were other forces at work trying to take advantage of this. So we did our best. We set up mist nets. This is Dr. Pat Reddig of the University of Minnesota Vet School, and a great raptor biologist in his own right. We had mist nets set up on top of Higbees, and we used a plastic great horned owl. And to make it look lively, we had to make it move. So if you notice in the upper right, that's me standing behind the HVAC unit. So I'm moving that great horned owl. Peregrine falcons hate great horned owls and do everything to attack and harass, if not kill them during the daytime. They have no defense against them at night. And so we caught the male over and over and over again. The female would be perched on top of the nearby flagpole and would resist our efforts. And so this is all the pictures of the male. But we finally succeeded with coming up with a great idea that Pat came up with. And he sent us these 4 mahogany eggs, carved eggs about the size of peregrine falcon eggs. And figuring that this female had great maternal instincts, just couldn't produce eggs because of, her odd F1 hybrid status. One day I went up there, I opened up the window, I slipped these in there, and within 15 minutes, she's on there incubating the eggs. And so the next day, Division of Wildlife showed up and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And at the appointed hour, we opened up the window. I reached out with a gloved hand. She is incredibly defensive of that. I reached down, she grabbed me, I grabbed her, and we had her removed from the wild. You see that her wing pits are pretty dark there. And she's got the thin malar stripe of a prairie falcon. But you look at her back on this first image on the left, she looks much more like a peregrine falcon. So this weird blending. They would sometimes find this hybrid F1s weren't bilaterally symmetrical. Like one wing might be a little bit longer. I mean, it's really odd hodgepodge. Falcon breeders still do this, but by law, they have to be hard imprints to humans. So this kind of thing doesn't happen. And they're supposed to be very, very closely regulated. So anyway, we grabbed her. She was sent up to the University of Minnesota vet school, the Raptor Center there, where she was used as a foster parent in their captive breeding work. But it didn't take very long for the male to recruit a new female. And this female actually was a year-old bird. This is a later picture of Zenith, but we found out later by reading her band that she actually came from Omaha, Nebraska. She came out of a nest site there, and talk about peregrinations, talk about wanderings. She ended up being somewhere in the vicinity of Cleveland, Ohio, where the male was able to recruit her. And so sure enough, really, really late around Memorial Day, they laid eggs, 2 eggs. Now there's only one problem. The problem was that they were opening up Tower City, the beautifully renovated terminal tower and the public spaces there. They were going to have a 4th of July concert by the Cleveland Orchestra, fireworks and cannons. And this is an endangered species that's breeding on the 12th floor ledge right above there. So the United States Fish and Wildlife Service said, you can't do that. And of course, the people who owned this said, what do you mean we can't do that? Well, we've got to market this building. And so we all said, okay, we huddled and said, the eggs are probably infertile. They were laid so late. So let's go up and grab the eggs and candle them to see if there's any sign of life. So this is a candling apparatus. Appointed hour, we went up there, and one of the Ohio Division of Wildlife biologists grabbed the eggs, and they brought them in, and then I candled them here, and sure enough, they were both very viable with visible embryos inside. So they were returned to the nest, and then we had to figure out, what are we going to do for phase 2? Well, this was the plan. Actually, these are the pictures from that night of the opening of Tower City. And the Cleveland Orchestra is just at the base of the terminal tower. And you can see that they had cannons going off on East 9th Street because they were doing the 1812 overture, which demands cannons. So it was a lot of noise. So the accommodation they got was this. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said, okay, we're going to station a biologist who's going to be peering through one of the windows at the nest site. They're going to have a radio. The person that's firing off the fireworks is going to have the other radio. And if they see any disturbance on the part of that incubating female, you're going to cease and desist the whole thing. Well, even though this looks really intrusive, what's this got on a thunderstorm with lightning and loud rumbling thunder? She didn't bat an eye. She happily incubated, and the Cleveland Orchestra played a lullaby for her, which was pretty cool. And so a couple days later, they hatched their youngsters, and they named them Stars and Stripes because they were hatched out about the time of the 4th of July. And this was the second successful nest site in the state of Ohio. And this is pretty cool. And the male was renamed Zell after George Zell, the famous conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, and the female Zenith from Omaha. And so at banding day, this is a much younger version of me and Stars and Stripes before they went out. So since that time, this nest has become one of those classic eyrie sites. We've got other nests in downtown Cleveland. We've got nests on the Hillary Road Bridge. They're down in the steel mills. But the terminal tower, more than any other of the buildings here, seems to be this ideal spot, the 12th floor outside the Greenbrier Ledge, and it's used year in and year out. And the established pair are challenged. Males are coming in challenging the male. Females got a brand new male at the nest site this year. So we're many pairs removed from the original Zell and Zenith. But this nest has been one of the most productive and prolific in the Midwest at turning out youngsters. And I love this scene when you're looking up at the cornice of, I think they're now calling the Cleveland Renaissance Hotel, and you've got Key Tower in the mist beyond. What's also cool is these birds, when they decide to fly, they don't leap off. All they have to do is just drop. And you go right into a dive. You see, again, the great-footed hawk. See how large that foot looks there. They're incredible parents, and you see the male coming in here now for the eggs are mahogany covered. This is many years later. This is 2012. But you can see the egg on the left in the foreground has pipped. You can see a large hole there, and actually the chick is actively in the process of hatching. And these birds are unbelievable parents. You know, they incubate, they keep them warm, no matter what the weather. This was from our Falcon cam. That's an incubating, that lump on the right side is an incubating female peregrine falcon. And she's keeping those eggs that are tight up against her flabby brood patch at about 100 degrees temperature, regardless of the fact that there's snow lying on her back. Also as tribute to the incredible insulative properties of feathers. Here's a food transfer. You have the male on the left who's just brought in this blue jay, but removed an awful lot of the feathers. For the female, you also see the difference in size. Male peregrine falcons are called tiercels because they're a third smaller than the females. It's a really big difference. It's almost only thing that eclipses it really are the accipiters, the Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks, where the male might be half the size of the female. But they're dutiful parents, and then when the busted day happens, this is what these guys look like. And it gets to be a pretty messy place up there because when you poop, well, unless you poop out towards public square, it's going to accumulate. And you see feeding there. They're considered semi-altricial birds, meaning they are totally dependent upon the female feeding them, but they have to reach up and grab the food. It's not like a baby songbird who sits with an open mouth waiting for the mom to plunge that food deep in the throat. And again, you see a couple of youngsters huddled together here. Typically, though it's not done anymore, when you get to about 2 to 3 weeks of age, their legs are now large enough they can accommodate an adult-sized band. And so they're brought in and banded, and the Ohio Division of Wildlife would usually make a great media event around that because you could have television and press there and get up close and personal with these birds who are cackling, and the parents are cackling. Parents do not fly away. They're sitting on the ledge outside, just waiting to grab somebody. A little bit of confusion when they go back out on the ledge as they're reunited with parents. But finally, things settle down. They don't stay in that nest platform very long. They become ledge walkers. So they like to get, once they can walk, they like to walk up and down the ledge and start practicing with their young wings. They're still lying down like a youngster, not standing up on their feet like an adult, but they're exercising those wings. And then finally, when they're around 6 to 7 weeks of age, they're taking their first flight. And that can be perilous because guess what direction the first flight goes? Down. They've never flown before. So if you go down, you end up on public square in traffic. So oftentimes there's a battery of volunteers that would fetch them and run them back up to the 12th floor until such time as they could feed. By the way, these ledges, particularly the 12th floor deep ledge, by the end of the season, it's like a graveyard of bird skeletons. There's all of these old woodcock and woodpeckers and pigeons and doves and cuckoos and you name it. The carcasses and feathers are all over the place because they're sampling whatever's coming through downtown Cleveland. They're if it's migratory season, they're going to go for whatever they can. And then finally, that picture I showed you later, where oftentimes the adults will train the youngsters when they're flying, they'll have food in their talons and the youngster will come up below them and then the adult will drop the food and then they actually have to run it down. They have to chase it down and grab it. So it's an active process of getting these guys roadworthy, as it were, in the canyons of downtown Cleveland. So it's been a great success story. If you're ever down on Public Square, take a look at the terminal tower, 12th floor ledge, just to the right of the main shaft, and you might see some actions there. You actually might see them perched. Sometimes they're in the edge of the key tower or any of the buildings around there, but that is definitely their hood. Though some peregrines like to wander a little further, and I love this picture. This is the 5 Mile Crib where Cleveland gets its water out off of the Lake Erie shoreline from downtown Cleveland. And they captured this image from one of their webcams out there of a peregrine falcon doing a pretty good soaring imitation and possibly hunting ducks out there or maybe gulls because they're not above taking a ring-billed gull as well. And if you want more about peregrine falcons, I highly recommend this site at Facebook, Chad and Chris Ohio Peregrine page. Chris and Chad Saladin are two remarkable people. They have careers. Chad is retired now, but they've had active careers that have nothing to do with wildlife biology, but they've been volunteer watchers at most of the nests in northeastern Ohio. And they are spectacular photographers, and they write the most detailed behavioral journals of the birds at the terminal tower, the birds at the St. Ignatius Church, at the Hilliard Road Bridge, at the Ohio Turnpike Bridge down in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, at the zoo under the I think it's Fulton Road Bridge. So check it out. This is an amazing picture where the peregrine falcon is attacking a poor hapless turkey vulture who happened to venture into Public Square. I don't think that turkey vulture is going to make that mistake again if it survived the encounter, because the peregrine is totally capable, if it does a headshot on a turkey vulture, of killing it. So where we stand now, these are the nesting sites in Ohio, and they're almost exclusively associated with buildings. So this is what peregrine falcons have morphed. We've taken advantage of that natural tendency they had towards our cities, both in terms of the prey base and the nesting opportunities. And that's where they're turning up. And it seems like if you were fledged off a building, you're inclined to want to nest on a building. Likewise, if you've fledged off a bridge, you're more inclined to nest on a bridge. So it's a great conservation success story. And remember, we were only down to 39 pair in the lower 48. Well, now this is the range of peregrine falcons in North America today. Maybe 3,000 pairs in North America. Great conservation success story. And those birds, particularly at these lower latitudes, are pretty much non-migratory. We definitely get migrants coming through, but these guys disperse more than they migrate as they're chased out. So peregrine falcon is back. And it's really cool and important that we take heart that when committed people band together and try and save something. And saving the peregrine falcon required so much from the standpoint of landmark legislation to clean up our waterways and our air, to banning DDT and other harmful chemicals, to giving them the extra protection of the Endangered Species Act, but also this intensive management, this clinical ornithology, if you will, of mastering how to get them to reproduce in captivity, and then take advantage of these traits like the ability to hack young birds, which was learned by falconers 1,000 years ago, and use those kinds of techniques to actually reintroduce them in the wild. Great, we should all pat ourselves on the back. However, in 2019, Cornell University came out with a study that demonstrated since 1970, in the same time that we've brought back the peregrine falcon and the bald eagle, that we've brought back waterfowl populations. Raptors are doing great, waterfowl are doing great, and just about everything else is not. We've lost 3 billion birds, almost 30% of the total population of birds in North America, gone since 1970. So clearly there's huge challenges ahead of us. And, you know, those challenges are the fact that if you're a migratory bird, if you're a songbird that nests in the boreal forest and goes to tropical rainforests, to conserve that bird, you need to protect their habitat up north. You need to protect their habitat in the south. And you better have some way stations along the way, you know, kind of like getting on a turnpike and see a sign, no services for next 1,000 miles. You know, they need that. And then we put up these perils like brightly lit buildings, like plate glass. We have these urban and suburban predators called cats that are incredibly devastating to wild birds. So we just need to take the lessons that we've learned about how we can achieve conservation success, and we just have to double down on everything else if we want to make sure that we have all the rest of the things around here. It reminds us that this planet we live on, and I use these slides a lot, but when you take a look at that thin haze of atmosphere, you know, the atmosphere that can sustain life maybe goes up, you know, 100,000 feet, maybe. And we'll go down to the bottom of the oceans and maybe a couple miles into the crust is a really thin zone that sustains life on this planet. And it's the only place, as far as we know, where life occurs. And we think it's really robust, but now we're finding that it's a constrained system. You know, nature explores and exploits the limits of a constrained system, but when we're changing climate or when the human footprint just is so expansive, there's nowhere else for creatures to be, that you have to believe that we're going to have a negative impact on the other things that reside in this. And that reminds us, when I worked at the Natural History Museum in the old Sears Hall, just near the front, they had this exhibit, curious exhibit, where a bunch of animals were looking at a TV screen, and on that TV screen was you. And there was a little scrolling message that said you are looking at the most dangerous large mammal on Earth, which kind of like, what? You're looking for the lion over your shoulder. But of course, we are the most dangerous large mammal on Earth. And this is a passenger pigeon, once the most common breeding bird, perhaps on planet Earth, with a population 5 to 7 billion strong, endemic to the great deciduous forests of eastern North America. And within 100 years, we caused their extinction, with the last bird finally dying at the Cincinnati Zoo, September 1st, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in 1914. We know the date and the time of extinction. So one of the things that I love is this line that the world we inherited is not ours, it's our responsibility. What happens is up to us. So just we need to redouble this whole sense of how can we take conservation from protecting a local habitat or restoring a local habitat to coming up with legislation that's sensible and allows for conservation on a global scale. And that's it. Thank you.
Incredible, Harvey. Thank you. That's why Ecophilia exists.
Any questions? You know it all.
So we have the room until 11:15 of fish. I don't think there's a
Oh,
meeting
okay.
after this, but I can guarantee him these 5 minutes.
Okay. Let's see, I can't. Hmm?
Before
great presentation. Thank you very much. And, my buddy Bob Hollister, he talks about the birds, peregrines that are out in the Pacific Northwest. They have like a subspecies because they hunt out over the ocean. Their fingers, their talons are actually larger, measurably larger, because they are not knocking birds down so much as grabbing them out of the air. And they have, evolved the Pacific.
So for those of you out in Zoom land, Steve Madewell was just making a point. He's got a good friend, Bob Hollister, who's a great musician and unbelievable falconer. And there's a subspecies of peregrine falcon, the Peel's peregrine falcon, which pretty much hugs the Canadian Pacific coast. And that those birds actually can be pelagic. They can actually go out over the water and they're hunting seabirds. They could be hunting everything from a murrelet to a puffin to a gull or what have you. And that their toes and talons are longer because more of their hunting has to be that snatching style as opposed to hitting something and letting it hit the ground because you might not be able to retrieve it off of the water. Yeah. Dan.
Wasn't a math quiz. I've been wrestling with this, the stats on, we've lost 3 billion birds over the last 50 years. But then there's this other stat that says we lose 1 billion birds a year to free-ranging cats. It doesn't quite.
Well, so if you figure that if their starting point might have been a population of 12, 13 billion birds, and they're sustaining mortality every year, and that mortality is definitely accentuated in fall migration with young birds that are inexperienced and they get into trouble. So that the cats and all that are part of that, but it's that overall that we're now at, if we were at 12, then that we're now a third less than that. So that's where they calculate it. You're right. And when you see the calculations about the impact of cats and the impact of buildings, a lot of this is based on kind of modeling the numbers because no one is actually doing that. I'll give you an example. Lights Out Cleveland. When we rebooted it in 2017 and rebranded it as Lights Out Cleveland, we added a monitoring component. So Tim Jasinski rallied a crew of volunteers and they walked the streets of Public Square, picking up the actual birds. And you had to be there at 5:30 in the morning because you know who else was there at 5:30 in the morning? The gulls. And the gulls were scavenging. They were the dead, the dying birds, they were scooping them up. If you did that same survey at 8:30, there'd be nothing there. And so, but by doing that, it turns out they're picking up thousands of birds every season. And they're just doing 3 routes. So, and one building in particular, a Rocket Mortgage Field House, was you could just stand there at that new glass atrium that opened up about 5 years ago, and you just watch birds hit, fall, hit, fall, hit, fall. I mean, it was just devastating. And as an aside, they are now allocating $850,000 to put on bird-friendly film on those windows so that the birds can actually see the windows and they don't fly into them. So kudos to Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. And they are participants in Lights Out Cleveland. But there's, it's just amazing when you start doing that monitoring and you figure out just how many birds are coming through downtown Cleveland. And we've picked up probably, I don't know, 10,000, 12,000 the years we've done it, just with a small group of volunteers doing 3 routes. You extrapolate from that and all of a sudden it's big. And then when you start hearing Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Birdcast that does this amazing job that will predict, given weather and Doppler radar, actual how many birds are flying over your county or your burg tonight. It's pretty cool, but a lot of it's based on modeling. It's not based on hard census, but the numbers should make us take pause. Okay, I think we need to ditch this room. So thank you all for participating, and thanks to Mindy and Minash and Brady and Darren Croft for letting us be here at CWRU. For those of you who aren't here, This is a really cool room, 4th floor clap hall. There's even beer in the fridge, though I'm not sure we're allowed to drink it. But anyway, it harkens back to the good old days. Just saying. Okay, folks, great to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah, real quick, this is Rich Benz. We do have a website, Ecophilia website. And if you email either Harvey or Steve or Rich Benz or Dan Best, we can send you to the website. And on the website is where we announce all the speakers that are coming up, and including for next month. And next month is about the reestablishment of a trout population in Northeast Ohio. Steve might be able to talk a little bit more about that. He's there in the audience.
You want to cue it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm yielding to Steve.
Thanks again, Harvey. This is Steve Madewell. I'm here with Harvey and a host of others down at Case. And again, I'd like to echo Harvey's sentiments on thanking everybody for putting this together. Next month's program, the Geauga Park District has got a very ambitious task underway. They've purchased a golf course, and on the golf course, there's an upwelling, a spring. And it just so happens that Geauga County is the home of the remaining native brook trout population in the state of Ohio, and the Park District has secured some funding. They're going to try to reestablish and recreate a brook trout stream on that golf course. So it should be a very wonderful program. Paul Pera is going to be doing that presentation. Again, this program today will be available on video on our website. Thanks to Rich for putting that together. And again, thanks to Harvey and Dan and Rich for helping putting together the ongoing programs here at Ecophilia. And with that, I think we'll sign off.
I just put the website for Ecophilia and on the chat, and it will be on the recording on YouTube.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Rich. And thanks to all of the folks here at Case. And we'll see you again next month, I think, at Case again.
Yeah, we can do it here. Yeah.
All right. All right, great. Thank you all.
Take care.
Question, where's the refrigerator?
It wasn't offered to us, but there is food.
Yeah, yeah, please, if anybody wants to take a plate, and a water bottle, please feel free.
Thanks, because they're all, I use Apple stuff. And so I really, I was like looking at it going
Nice,
like,
totally.
where are we at? Yeah, a little different.
Yeah, Minnie, you don't have to like